Donald Trump has upended the transatlantic alliance since taking office, resetting ties with Moscow and casting doubt on America's commitment to European security. The man who will likely become Germany's next chancellor, Friedrich Merz of the conservative Christian Democrats, has publicly questioned the future of NATO with Donald Trump in the White House. Merz admitted the United States is largely indifferent to the fate of Europe and suggested it should consider an independent defence capability. On Monday, he developed that thought a little further. Merz told the German broadcaster ZDF, "We need to have discussions with both the British and the French, the two European nuclear powers, about whether nuclear sharing, or at least nuclear security from the UK and France, could also apply to us." And to talk more about that, I'm joined here in the studio by Julia Berghofer. She's a senior policy fellow at the European Leadership Network. That's a think tank focusing on defence and security issues. Welcome, Julia. Thank you so much for joining us here. Could you give us more details about what exactly Friedrich Merz was talking about there?
Yeah, so first of all, the context in which he made these remarks is quite interesting. So he made the statement just one day ahead of the election, which I think was a bit of a tactical move. You shouldn't necessarily drop something serious as that in a morning show, but yet he did so. So he spoke about nuclear sharing, and what he meant by that is a bit unclear. So I think his remarks were a bit lacking substance, because in effect we are already in a situation where we are involved in nuclear sharing. In the NATO context, of course, but he criticized NATO. But we also benefit from nuclear protection from the French and the British side already. The French are quite explicit about that. The British are as well. So it's a bit unclear what he's talking about in that context. And I think, again, it was a bit of a tactical statement, and now it's out in the world, so we have to deal with these notions.
And try and figure out what exactly... I mean, is he potentially talking about, I don't know, paying rent, giving several million, billion, whatever, and to then say, if we do have a problem, France and Britain, please step up. I mean, is that something that, does that make sense to you?
Well, the interesting thing is, for example, the Brits are quite explicit in terms of extending their nuclear protection to other allies. So, for example, in their strategic documents, they already say, we would consider using nuclear weapons only in very extreme circumstances, including to the defense of our allies. The French, in their strategic documents, always emphasize that their force de frappe also has a European dimension. At the same time, both the French and the British arsenals are quite small. So it's quite unthinkable that, for example, Germany or other European countries could just rent, 2 out of 4 British submarines, 1 out of 4 French submarines or missiles. So they're not really made to kind of provide other European partners. I mean, the arsenals are not there to provide other European partners with capabilities. So that's a problem.
Merz said that the French had repeatedly suggested the idea of extending their nuclear protection to Germany in past years. Why are the French keen to do that? Why are they suggesting that if, as you say, their nuclear arsenal isn't that big? And also, how long would it take to actually make something like that a reality?
Well, so the interesting thing is deterrence is not something that you can easily measure in figures. I mean, when you look at what, for example, French experts write about their deterrence thinking, which is obviously quite different from our thinking, they always emphasize it's about credibility, it's about showing the intent that you're ready to use nuclear weapons, and that translates into the perception of your adversary. So that means the size of your nuclear arsenal doesn't tell you exactly whether it's credible or not. So that's just a notion to begin with. Friedrich Merz is right that the French have over the last couple of decades, always offered some sort of strategic dialogue about whether or not the force de frappe could have a potential European dimension. And Macron was very explicit in 2020 when he said the force de frappe does have a European dimension, but it never got to a point where they really offered some sort of nuclear sharing or, I don't know, deploying one Rafale fighter jet to Germany. So they've been very vague as well.
Let's talk about the British. They're obviously not in the European Union anymore. They've always enjoyed closer ties to the US. What do you think their stance will be on this idea of building an alternative nuclear deterrent together with the Europeans?
Well, I don't think that, for example, a UK-EU nuclear deterrent is something feasible because the EU itself is not going to be a nuclear alliance just for the fact that you have so many different opinions. There are some countries in the EU that have signed a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So for political reasons, it's not feasible. And at the same time, as I said, the UK already sees its nuclear deterrence as serving as some kind of European protection as well. So I wouldn't see any eagerness from the British side to be involved in such a dialogue, and they've never showed any readiness to talk about these issues. So I think it's a bit different from France.
You talked about their people's perceptions, how people would feel about it. Obviously, because of Germany's past, it needs to tread very carefully when it comes to all things military. I mean, how will this discussion, this idea of nuclear sharing, potentially its own nuclear weapons, how would this go down with the German public?
So it's interesting how the German public has kind of shifted its opinion. I think 2022 was really a watershed moment. So before, people were much more critical about the rationale behind nuclear deterrence writ large. I think right now, since 2022, 2023, people are more convinced that nuclear deterrence is actually something that serves their interest. But at the same time, when we look at opinion polls, for example, Körbet Stiftung has done one very interesting opinion poll in 2023, and about 90% of people were against Germany having its own nuclear weapons. So I think developing an independent Germany nuclear deterrent is completely off the table. I think it wouldn't resonate positively.
So we don't even have to talk about whether it has the necessary infrastructure, the money. That is not something that you can see as a likely scenario.
No, absolutely not. And as you just raised the question of defense spending, I mean, Germany already had difficulties reaching the 2% goal, and now we're talking about another Sondervermögen. So I think this is that would be a very, very painful and lengthy debate.
Also, from the outside looking in, I mean, we've talked about Germany's past. France and Britain obviously went to war with Germany in the 20th century. I mean, is Germany seen by its neighbours as a country that can be trusted with this nuclear infrastructure, or is that something that is comfortable to talk about?
That's an interesting question. I think European partners do trust Germany to a big extent. Maybe our self-doubt was sometimes bigger than the trust that others had in us. But I think no one in Europe would really think that this makes sense. And I should also add one point which I find interesting, especially the Baltic states, for example, are so vulnerable. I mean, they are facing the Russian threat like on a day-by-day basis when we look at Estonia especially, and they have a different debate. I mean, they're not talking about getting their own nuclear arsenal. They're more concerned about the conventional threat. So I think we in Germany should more look at conventional deterrence, which is also part of deterrence, and strengthen that leg, which is more realistic.
And just a last question. I mean, how do you think people in Germany are feeling right now? We've just had this election. There's this shifting transatlantic situation. The fact that we're talking about nuclear deterrence, nuclear weapons, what's the sense in Germany right now?
Well, I figure that people are really anxious, and I can understand that. When I wake up in the morning and I read the news, I'm quite anxious as well. There's a lot of uncertainty, but I would really refrain from drawing conclusions too early and just getting rid of NATO and the transatlantic bonds because of the things that we've seen in the last couple of days.
Julia Berghofer with the European Leadership Network. Julia, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.